Jeff, one of the questions that I get asked a lot at the fishing shows and in some of the talks that I give is what kind of rod should I use for jigging? And it's a good question, and a lot depends on where you're coming from. Now, in this area, a lot of the guys have started out trolling, and they may need to buy a rod. On the other hand, there's a lot of guys like you and I who come to it from the bass fishing world. We probably got something on our shelf or in our shop right now that we can use. You can see I got a whole lot of rods over there that are just sitting there gathering dust because I'm very specific about the rod that I like to use for striped bass jigging. And you know, people don't think it, but you can get away with a lot lighter rod for striped bass in open water than you can for black bass in heavy cover. So we're using really little, small, light rods. And you know, this is a rod by one manufacturer. It's got some advantages and disadvantages. Everything's a trade-off at some point, but you can kind of narrow it down so that you've got the, maybe not the perfect rod, but a very good rod to do what you need to do when you get out there jigging. This specific rod is a 6/8 extra fast. It's medium weight. You know, a lot of guys like the medium heavy rods. I like the medium because they're just a little bit more sensitive. But one thing that I insist on is that extra fast tip. Now, the speed of the rod, just all that refers to is how stiff your tip is and how much it bounces back. And you don't want a whole lot of bounce, at least to my way of thinking. You don't want a whole lot of bounce in this tip when you're striper fishing, especially when you're dropping a jig. Now, if I'm topwater fishing or something, that's a different story, but we're talking about jigging here. So I want a really stiff rod. And frankly, the shorter the better. This is a 6/8 rod. If I could get a 6/6 rod or maybe even a 6-foot rod, I'd go with it. But this is like I said, a good trade-off. Now let's talk about the reel a little bit. So I'm a big fan of bait casters for jigging. Now that doesn't mean that you can't catch just as many fish and just as big a fish with a spinning outfit, but I just like a bait caster for several different reasons. And one of those reasons is because you can reset your lure a whole lot easier into the strike zone with a bait caster. When you're jigging, a lot of times, you know, you're sitting there and you're drifting probably over the fish and then off the fish because you got wind and you got current and you've got all kinds of factors that are moving you around when you're on the water. And with a bait caster, all you have to do when your lure rides up and out of the strike zone, which it's likely to do when you're moving off the fish, is hit the button and drop it right back down. And you can't always do that with a spinning outfit unless you're, unless you're just holding your finger on the bail. So all you have to do is just click that button, you know, drop the line, and then click it back, and you're right back in the strike zone. Now, I think I've showed you before that I like a rod with a cutout reel seat. I wouldn't even mind if it's a little more than this, because I like to get some fingers underneath the reel in contact with that blank. And so I keep a finger right there on that blank. And then when I'm jigging, I've got my other hand wrapped around the handle. It's a low profile reel, obviously. And then a couple of fingers up here on the blank ahead of the reel seat. That's my fulcrum right there, and that's where I'm going to feel the strike first. As it comes up that line and travels down the rod, I'll feel that strike right there first thing. Sometimes you see it before you feel it, but you need a sensitive rod. So you feel that strike. This is, I think this is probably 15-pound test line here, braided line. I don't have a preference for the brand of braided line. I move up to 15-pound test sometimes this time of year because we're going out chasing, you know, 40, 50-pound fish sometimes. But you can land those 40 and 50-pound fish on 10-pound test just as easily, and a lot of my partners use 10-pound test line. It's all about resistance to current in the water. The thinner your line, the more likely you are to feel the strike, and the less drift you get in your line as the current pulls your line around. So you know, the difference between 10-pound test or 15-pound test braid and 20-pound test or even 30-pound test braid isn't that great when you line them up side by side. But when you've got 50 yards of line out there and the current running 7-8 miles per hour or even faster at some locations, you're going to get a big bow in that line, and you've got a lot more mass in the water when you've got heavier line. So lighter line equals less bow in your line, a more direct route from the rod tip to the lure, so you feel the strike. So let's talk about leader now. So a lot of times people ask me, what kind of leader do you use and how long should your leader be? Well, I don't really get into the fluoro mono debate that much because sometimes I use both. I think you probably do have a little bit of an advantage using fluoro, but striped bass, their eyesight just isn't that good, and they're not leader shy, so you can get away with mono. Now I do like, this time of year I'm going to use 30-pound test. I might even go to 40-pound test, but most of the time I'm using 30-pound test. So the question is, how long do you want it to be? And so the answer to that is, you want it long enough to clear the dorsal fin of the biggest fish you think you'll catch. So we're going after big fish today, so you know what, that's probably about right. So the reason for that is twofold. For one thing, if you get a big fish on, and you've got the hook set, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to lower your rod tip and point that rod toward the fish, because a big fish is going to run. He's going to take off right directly across from the boat, away from the boat. And then so you're letting your drag do the work at that point. But eventually the fish is going to get tired, and when he gets tired, he's going to do one of two things. He's either going to roll or he's going to dive. And either way, other parts of the fish besides its mouth is going to come in contact with your line. So braid is not very abrasion resistant at all, but leader is very abrasion resistant. So you want something that when another part of that fish, for example the gill plate or the dorsal fin, comes in contact with your line, it doesn't cut it. Now, if you've ever handled a striper, even a small one, you know that those gill plates are very, very sharp. They'll cut your finger, and they'll cut line like that. Same way with the dorsal fin, it's also really sharp too. Now a lot of times when you get a big fish on and he gets tired, you can feel that line popping over the top of that dorsal fin. You can almost count them, pop, 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 and you'll think your line's breaking. But it's not. It's just popping over that dorsal fin, and that's why you need a good leader, and it has to be long enough to clear that dorsal fin.
A whole lot of drag pulling. Woo! He's going. He just had a nice long run. Pop. Feel that. Pop. Oh, it just popped.
Did you hear pop?
You saw it.
That's that leader on the dorsal fin. If you didn't have a leader, you'd have a broke off fish right there. Beautiful.
Yeah, they went good. Got it. Oh yes, another heavy.
Okay, so let's tie on the leader now. My favorite knot is a uni to uni, or some people call it a double uni, and it's a real easy knot to tie. All you do is just lay one length of your line over the other. Here's your braid, here's your leader. Lay one over the other. Start with your leader. It's just like tying your shoe. Wrap it and back through just like a square knot, except go a couple more times and pull it tight. Now do the same thing with your braid on this side. Tie your shoe. Another time, let's go 6 times. Let's do 7 for good measure. Pull it tight, wet it, cinch it up. You can hear it pop when it's right. Cut off your tags, and there's your knot. I trust that knot as much as I trust any knot that I've ever used. I even tie braid to braid with that knot sometimes. Some of my fishing partners give me a hard time because I use colored braid so I can see it. And sometimes I'll get a big fish on and it's running, and you'll see 2 or 3 different colors of braid out there. I don't recommend that, but I do trust that knot just as much as I trust the line, so it's a good knot. All right, so let's talk about the terminal knot, the knot that you use to attach the leader to the lure. My first rule here is no additional hardware. I don't like any kind of terminal hardware. No swivels, no snaps, nothing like that, because that just interferes with your sensitivity when you get a strike. And like I was saying earlier, you don't want anything between you and that rod tip except your lure so you can feel that strike. But there's two schools of thought here. A lot of my fishing partners like a loop knot. Most of the time though, I just go with a improved clinch knot. And it's a real easy knot to tie, and it's really fast. So all you do is just go through your hook eye and wrap it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Back through, not the hook eye, but back through the loop that you created, and then go back through your original loop at the top. And that's an improved clinch knot. Pull it tight. Sometimes you have to wet it a little bit. Cut off your tag. You don't want to leave a whole lot of tag out there. And that's it. And that knot will never fail.
Good.
So another question that's asked a lot is, how do you set your drag? Well, you know, we sometimes joke that we have summer drags and winter drags, and we set them a little harder during the winter, but actually it's all about the same. And you can make this really complicated, and you can get gauges, and you can try to figure it all out, but there's no point in that. Really, all you have to do is just grab your line in front of the reel, wrap it around your finger, and pull. And you need to be able to feel some resistance, but there shouldn't be enough resistance to where you're going to cut your finger with that braid. And remember, this is 10 or 15 pound test braid. So that's just a little light, so I'm going to just tighten it up just a hair there. And that's perfect. See, it takes a little bit for me to pull it out. It's not easy, but it's not cutting my finger either. So that's the way to set a drag. Trust me, your chances of breaking off from over tightening a drag are a lot greater than for a big fish to spool you when you've got an adequately set drag. So let the fish run. It's not going to spool you in most cases, and leave that drag alone once you get a big fish on.